The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Jenna made her way downstairs, already thinking about Maya's breakfast. But something was different today. Maya wasn't waiting by her food bowl like usual. Instead, she was pacing the living room floor, her breathing heavy, her body tense. Jenna's heart quickened. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. "Bradley!" she called, her voice edged with concern. Something's wrong with Maya. Bradley rushed in, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. Maya let out a low whimper, her body trembling. And then it hit Jenna. Maya wasn't just in distress. She was in labor. "Oh my God," Jenna whispered, sinking to her knees beside Maya. "It's happening." They had known Maya was pregnant, but they had no idea when her time would come. Now, as she laid down, panting heavily, Jenna's instincts took over. She grabbed the blankets they had set aside for her bed and placed them beneath Maya, stroking her fur gently. "We need to get her to the vet," Bradley said, already reaching for the car keys. "There's no time," Jenna said, her voice firm. "She's too far along." For the next 2 hours, they stayed by her side, comforting her as she labored. Then, finally, a single, tiny figure emerged. Jenna sucked in a breath. Something was wrong. The puppy was small, much smaller than they had expected. Its tiny body was twisted, its legs slightly curled in unnatural angles. Its ears were sharp, almost fox-like, and one of its eyes was a deep amber while the other was an icy blue. Bradley's face paled as he exchanged a look with Jenna. "This isn't normal," he murmured. Jenna didn't hesitate. Carefully, she lifted the fragile newborn, rubbing it gently with a warm towel. Maya, exhausted but alert, nosed her baby anxiously, licking its tiny face with soft whimpers of encouragement. "We need to get him checked out," Jenna said, standing with determination. At the vet's office, Dr. Whitmore examined the puppy with a deepening frown. The silence stretched, making Jenna's chest tighten. "He's alive," the vet finally said, his voice careful. "But he's got severe congenital deformities. I don't know if he'll survive." Jenna's grip tightened on Bradley's hand. "But he's fighting," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Look at him." The puppy, despite its frail body, let out a tiny, defiant squeak. Its mismatched eyes blinked up at them with a surprising amount of awareness. Jenna felt something shift inside her. "He deserves a chance," she whispered. Dr. Whitmore sighed. "You'll need to be prepared for a difficult road. He might never walk properly. He might not even make it through the week." But Jenna wasn't listening. She had already made her decision. "We're taking him home." Days turned into weeks. Jenna and Bradley cared for the tiny pup around the clock. They named him Finn, a name that meant small but mighty. His legs were weak, and at first he struggled to even lift his head. But every day, he fought. He grew stronger. When Maya nudged him forward with her nose, he would stumble, but he never gave up. Jenna worked tirelessly, massaging his limbs, using warm towels to keep his tiny muscles from tightening further. One evening, as she sat on the floor, gently coaxing Finn with a piece of soft food, something miraculous happened. He wobbled forward, his little legs trembling beneath him, and then he took a step. Tears blurred Jenna's vision as she turned to Bradley. "He's walking." Bradley knelt beside her, watching in awe as Finn took another unsteady step toward Maya. The proud mother licked his head as if she had never doubted him. Weeks turned into months, and Finn defied every expectation. His twisted body adapted, his movements uniquely his own. What should have been his weakness became his strength. He was faster than anyone expected, his agility unmatched. When Maya played with him, he darted between her legs with a cleverness that had them both laughing. And despite what the vet had warned, Finn not only survived, he thrived. The first time Jenna took him to the park, she braced herself for the stares, the whispers. But Finn didn't care. He ran, chasing the breeze with a joy that was infectious. People stopped to watch, their expressions shifting from pity to admiration. One little girl, her pigtails bouncing as she ran up, pointed at Finn with wide eyes. "Mommy, look at that puppy." "He's magic." Jenna smiled, her heart swelling. Yes, she whispered, watching Finn leap over a patch of grass, his mismatched eyes gleaming in the sunlight. He really is. Dr. Whitmore, who had doubted his survival, was stunned the next time he saw Finn. I don't know how he did it, he admitted, shaking his head. But I was wrong. He's remarkable. Jenna looked down at Finn, who sat beside her, his tail wagging, his sharp ears perked up. No, she said softly. He was never broken. He was just different. And different is extraordinary. As they walked home, Finn trotting confidently by her side, Jenna realized something: sometimes the ones who seem the weakest turn out to be the strongest of all. And Finn, against all odds, had proved them all wrong. Bradley watched his wife's dedication with a mixture of admiration and worry. Jenna barely slept, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but she refused to slow down. Every 2 hours, like clockwork, she cradled Nico in her hands, gently pressing the bottle to his tiny mouth as he weakly suckled. Maya, ever watchful, rested her head beside Jenna, occasionally nosing the fragile pup as if reassuring herself that he was still there. One night, as Jenna rocked Nico in her arms, Bradley sat beside her on the couch, rubbing his hands together anxiously. Jen, I know you love him, he said softly. But what if Dr. Langston was right? What if you're just prolonging his suffering? Jenna's grip on Nico tightened. He's not suffering, Brad, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He's fighting. And as long as he's fighting, I'm not giving up on him. Bradley exhaled, running a hand down his face. I just don't want to see you get hurt. Jenna finally met his gaze, her eyes shining with determination. I've been through loss before, she whispered. I know what it feels like to want something so badly and have it ripped away. I won't let that happen again. Not to him. Bradley swallowed hard, understanding the deeper weight behind her words. He reached out, wrapping his arms around Jenna and Nico, holding them both close. As the weeks passed, Nico's tiny frame grew stronger. He was still small, still frail, but his mismatched eyes shone with a quiet determination. He wobbled when he tried to walk, his limbs weaker than they should have been, but he never stopped trying. Every stumble, every fall was met with an attempt to rise again. Maya became his guardian, licking him gently whenever he squeaked in frustration, guiding him with her nose when his steps faltered. Jenna cheered for every milestone, no matter how small his first wobbly steps, the first time he managed to lap up water from a shallow dish, the first time he let out a tiny, raspy bark. One evening, as Jenna sat on the floor, Nico curled up against her leg. Bradley knelt beside them. You were right, he admitted, rubbing the pup's head gently. He's a fighter. Jenna smiled, tears welling in her eyes. I told you. But the real test came when Nico turned 8 weeks old. Dr. Langston sighed as he examined him, shaking his head. His legs are weak, his spine is misaligned, and his vision is limited, he said, glancing at Jenna and Bradley. But I'll be honest, I didn't think he'd make it this far. He's got an incredible will to live. Jenna beamed, holding Nico close. So, what do we do now? Dr. Langston leaned back. There are options: physical therapy, special braces to help his legs strengthen. It won't be easy, and he may never be like other dogs. But if you're willing to put in the work, he has a chance at a good life. Jenna didn't hesitate. We'll do whatever it takes. Bradley exhaled, nodding. Yeah, whatever it takes. Over the next few months, their home transformed into a makeshift rehabilitation center. Jenna and Bradley took turns helping Nico with physical therapy, gently stretching his legs, encouraging him to walk with tiny braces supporting his fragile limbs. Maya was his constant source of strength, guiding him, nudging him when he hesitated, lying beside him when exhaustion took over. And then, one bright morning, it happened. Bradley was outside, setting up Nico's therapy area, when Jenna called out, Brad, come here, quick! Heart pounding, he rushed inside to find Jenna kneeling on the living room floor, tears streaming down her face. Nico really stood on his own. His little body trembled, his legs wobbling under his weight, but he remained upright. Then, with a deep breath, he took one step. Then another. And another. By the time he reached Maya, who was waiting patiently a few feet away, Jenna was sobbing into Bradley's chest. He did it, she whispered. He really did it. Bradley wrapped an arm around her, his own throat tight with emotion. Yeah, he said, voice thick. He proved everyone wrong. Nico had defied the odds. And he wasn't done yet. The automatic doors of the veterinary clinic slid open with a soft hiss. Maya walked beside Jenna, her posture alert, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar environment. She didn't flinch at the unfamiliar sense of antiseptic and fur that filled the air, nor at the distant whimpers of other animals in the waiting area. Her only concern was the tiny bundle wrapped in Jenna's arms, Nico, nestled in a soft blanket, his mismatched eyes blinking sluggishly as he rested against her chest. Bradley followed closely, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He had been dreading this visit, terrified of what they might hear. Jenna, however, walked with quiet determination, her grip on Nico firm as if she could protect him from whatever fate the world had in store. Dr. Langston greeted them with a small, knowing smile. Come in, he said, motioning toward the exam room. Jenna gently placed Nico on the examination table. Maya whined, pressing her nose against her pup, reluctant to let him go. Jenna stroked her head reassuringly. It's okay, girl. We're here to help him. Dr. Langston examined Nico with careful precision. He pressed gently against the puppy's weak limbs, ran his fingers over his spine, checked his reflexes. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, he straightened, removing his stethoscope with a sigh. Well, Bradley asked, his voice tight. Is there anything we can do? Dr. Langston glanced between them before speaking. Nico has a lot of challenges. His legs are weak, his spine slightly misaligned. His vision may never be perfect, and feeding will always be a struggle due to his jaw. But, he paused, he's fighting. That alone tells me something. Jenna held her breath, waiting. If he were suffering, if I thought he had no quality of life, I would tell you, Dr. Langston continued. But this little guy has a remarkable spirit. With therapy, the right support, and a lot of patience, he has a chance. Jenna exhaled, a mix of relief and determination flooding her. Then we'll do whatever it takes. Bradley swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair. He had come here bracing for the worst, but now, looking at the fragile creature on the table, he felt the same thing he had the night he found Jenna sleeping with Nico curled against her chest. Hope. Dr. Langston gave them instructions, physical therapy exercises to help strengthen Nico's muscles, a special diet plan, and recommendations for a custom brace to support his weak legs. It won't be easy, he warned. Some days, it'll feel impossible. But if anyone can do this, I believe it's you two. As they left the clinic, Maya stayed close to Nico's side, as if understanding that today had been important. The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. That night, Jenna carefully fitted Nico into his tiny leg braces. He squirmed at first, unused to the new sensation, but Maya gave him a gentle lick, as if to tell him it was okay. Come on, little guy, Jenna encouraged, kneeling beside him. Let's give it a try. Nico wobbled on unsteady legs. His muscles trembled, his body swayed. For a second, it seemed like he would collapse. But then, with sheer determination, he steadied himself. Bradley leaned forward, holding his breath. Slowly, hesitantly, Nico took a step. Then another. Tears welled in Jenna's eyes. You're doing it, she whispered. Maya let out a soft, approving chuff, watching her pup with quiet pride. Bradley crouched beside them, rubbing the back of his neck. Guess we're really doing this, huh? He murmured. Jenna turned to him, eyes shining. We always were. Days turned to weeks. Nico's therapy became routine. Every morning and evening, Jenna and Bradley took turns guiding him through his exercises, stretching his legs, encouraging each step. Some days were good. Nico would take a few confident steps before tumbling into Maya's waiting paws. Other days were hard, his small body refusing to cooperate, exhaustion weighing him down. But he never gave up. Neither did they. One afternoon, Jenna sat in the backyard, watching Nico attempt to chase a butterfly. He wasn't fast, not like a normal puppy, but he was determined. His mismatched eyes tracked the fluttering wings, his legs carrying him forward in an unsteady but enthusiastic pursuit. Bradley stepped onto the porch, watching the scene unfold. You were right, he said softly, sitting beside Jenna. She smiled at him. About what? Bradley nodded toward Nico. About him. About giving him a chance. Jenna reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. He's teaching us something, you know? Bradley glanced at her. What's that? She looked at Nico's small, imperfect, but full of life. That being different doesn't mean being broken. It just means the world needs to make room for something special. Bradley exhaled, shaking his head with a small chuckle. I married a stubborn woman. Jenna smirked. You love it. Maya let out a soft bark as Nico finally caught up to the butterfly, only for it to dart away again. Undeterred, he wobbled forward, determined to try again. And just like that, the little pup who wasn't supposed to survive proved everyone wrong. He was here. He was thriving. And he was just getting started. Nico squirmed at first, unused to the sensation of the harness. His tiny frame tensed, mismatched eyes wide with uncertainty. But then Maya, ever the patient mother, nuzzled him gently, her warm breath steadying him. Jenna crouched beside them, her heart in her throat. You're okay, little guy, she murmured, adjusting the straps with gentle fingers. We've got you. Bradley stood nearby, arms crossed, watching with cautious optimism. He had seen Jenna pour hours into research, stitching together that tiny harness with the same care a mother would give to swaddling her newborn. He had doubted at first. He still did sometimes. But looking at the determination on Jenna's face, the quiet devotion in Maya's every movement, and the tiny pup fighting against his own limits, Bradley couldn't deny the shift happening in his heart. Nico trembled but didn't protest as Jenna helped him to his feet. His legs wobbled, bowing outward in their usual struggle to hold his weight. Jenna held her breath as he swayed dangerously to one side, then the other. And then, to everyone's amazement, he took a step. Just one. Just a small, wobbly, uncertain step. But it was a step. Jenna gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Bradley let out a low whistle. Even Maya let out a short, approving huff, watching her pup with what could only be described as motherly pride. You did it, Nico, Jenna breathed, blinking back tears. Encouraged, Nico tried again. He took another step, then another. The movements were shaky, awkward, his legs trembling with the effort. But he was moving. Bradley crouched beside Jenna, shaking his head in awe. I can't believe it, he said, running a hand through his hair. He's really trying. Jenna turned to him, her eyes shining. Of course he is, she whispered. He just needed a chance. From that day forward, every small victory felt monumental. Each morning, Jenna strapped Nico into his harness and helped him practice. Some days, he managed to take a few steps before collapsing in a heap. Other days, frustration won out, and he'd whimper, curling into Maya's side. But he never gave up. Neither did they. Weeks passed. Nico grew stronger. His legs, though still weak, held him for longer stretches of time. His once clumsy movements became more intentional, his spirit outpacing his fragile body. The doubts that had once filled Bradley's mind began to dissolve, replaced by something else entirely: pride. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jenna and Bradley sat in the backyard watching Nico attempt something neither of them had expected: play. Maya had dropped a small ball in front of her son, nudging it toward him. For a moment, Nico just stared at it, confused. Then, with an awkward hop, he lunged forward. His little paws swatted at the ball, sending it rolling across the grass. He let out a delighted yip and chased after it, his movements still unsteady but filled with determination. Bradley exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. He's a miracle, isn't he? Jenna leaned against his shoulder, watching Nico and Maya with a soft smile. He's family. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of amber and violet, Nico curled up beside Maya on the porch. His little body was still fragile, still different, but he was here. He was loved. And he was proving everyone wrong. Maya's stance was firm, her body tense but controlled as the off-leash dogs rushed closer. The golden retriever, its barks sharp and territorial, slowed just feet away, suddenly unsure. Maya's eyes locked onto the larger dog with a quiet authority, her tail held high, her muscles coiled but not aggressive. Nico, trembling beside Jenna, whimpered softly. Jenna's heart clenched at the fear in his mismatched eyes, but before she could react, Maya made her move. She stepped forward, her body a shield, her presence unwavering. The golden retriever hesitated, ears twitching back, sensing something unspoken in Maya's posture. The rest of the dogs, following the retriever's lead, slowed their approach, no longer charging but now sniffing curiously from a distance. Bradley exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "She's protecting him," Jenna whispered, gripping Nico's harness a little tighter. The golden retriever gave one last bark, but Maya didn't flinch. Instead, she took a single step forward, not aggressively, but with a quiet dominance that made the retriever drop its head slightly, its tail wagging in slow submission. The energy shifted, the hostility melting into wary acceptance. A moment later, the owner of the golden retriever jogged over, clipping a leash onto his dog. "Sorry about that," he said, looking embarrassed. His gaze flickered to Nico, taking in the harness, the slightly bowed legs, the determined but nervous expression on the little pup's face. "He's different, huh?" Bradley's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Jenna spoke, her voice calm but firm. "He's a fighter." The man nodded, watching Nico for a beat longer before muttering an awkward apology and walking away with his dog. The other off-leash dogs lost interest and scattered back to their owners. Jenna knelt beside Nico, running a soothing hand down his back. "You okay, buddy?" she asked, softly. Nico let out a small whimper, but then, as if drawing courage from Maya's unwavering presence, he took a hesitant step forward. Then another. His mismatched eyes flickered toward Maya, and she rewarded him with a gentle nuzzle. Bradley let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. "That dog of yours, she just stared down a whole pack." Jenna smiled, warmth filling her chest. "She knows he belongs here." For the rest of their walk, Maya stayed close to Nico, her presence keeping him steady. The whispers and curious stares of the parkgoers no longer held the same weight. Nico was out in the world, and he was proving step by step that he deserved to be there. Back home, the golden hues of sunset cast long shadows across the living room as Nico curled up beside Maya in their favorite spot near the fireplace. Jenna and Bradley sat together on the couch, watching them, reflecting on how far they had all come. Bradley sighed, rubbing his hands together. "You know, when we first brought Maya home, I wasn't sure what we were getting into." And then Nico, he shook his head. "I thought we were setting ourselves up for heartbreak." Jenna rested her head on his shoulder. "So did I at first." "But look at him," Bradley murmured, watching as Nico stretched his tiny limbs, now stronger, steadier than before. "He's thriving." Jenna reached out, brushing her fingers over Maya's thick fur, because she never gave up on him. And neither did we. Maya opened her eyes just slightly, as if she understood, then let out a slow, contented sigh before pressing her nose against Nico's side. Bradley reached over, taking Jenna's hand. "You were right," he admitted. "He just needed a chance." Jenna smiled, squeezing his fingers. And he proved everyone wrong. As night settled over their home, Nico stirred, lifting his head to glance at Jenna and Bradley. His mismatched eyes, once filled with uncertainty, now held something new: confidence, belonging, family. And as Maya tucked her son closer, wrapping him in the warmth of her presence, Jenna knew, without a doubt, that Nico was exactly where he was meant to be. A new chapter began. Jenna exhaled shakily, pressing her free hand against her stomach as if she could already feel the tiny life growing inside her. After years of heartbreak, of disappointment after disappointment, she had almost stopped believing this moment would ever come. Yet here it was undeniable proof in the form of 2 pink lines. She looked down at Nico, who was still nestled against her, his mismatched eyes peering up at her with an eerie sense of knowing. Maya, ever watchful, let out a quiet sigh and rested her chin on Jenna's knee, her warmth grounding her in the moment. Bradley stirred beside her, blinking away sleep as his gaze landed on her, his brow furrowed, concern flickering across his face. "Jen?" His voice was thick with sleep. "Are you okay?" Jenna couldn't find the words. Instead, She simply held up the test, her hand trembling. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, Bradley sat up quickly, taking the test from her hands, staring at it as if he didn't trust his own eyes. His breath caught in his throat. "It's real?" His voice cracked on the last word. Jenna nodded, a choked laugh bubbling from her lips as tears streamed down her cheeks. "It's real." Without hesitation, Bradley pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he dared. His grip spoke of years of longing, of silent prayers whispered into the void, of hope that had always felt just out of reach. His shoulders shook, and Jenna realized he was crying too. Maya nudged them both gently, as if offering silent reassurance. And then Nico, their tiny, imperfect miracle, stretched his twisted legs and let out a soft, contented sigh. It was as if he understood that this was more than just a new beginning. It was the closing of an old wound. Unbreakable bonds. The days that followed felt surreal. Jenna floated through them, alternating between joy and fear. Every ache, every twinge sent a flicker of worry racing through her. But Maya was always there, watching over her with the same fierce protectiveness she had shown Nico. Nico, on the other hand, had become inseparable from Jenna. He refused to let her out of his sight, always curling up against her stomach or resting his head on her lap. It was as if he could sense the new life growing inside her, and in his own way, he was already protecting it. One evening, as Bradley worked late at the firehouse, Jenna sat on the couch, absent-mindedly running her fingers through Maya's fur, while Nico lay curled against her belly. The quiet hum of the house wrapped around her like a warm embrace. She glanced down at Nico, who had dozed off, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. A rush of love overwhelmed her, and she leaned down to kiss the top of his head. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. "You and Maya both." Maya let out a low huff, shifting slightly, as if to say, "Of course we did." Jenna chuckled softly, stroking her belly absent-mindedly. "You two never gave up on me. Maybe that's why I never gave up on you. A life worth fighting for." Months passed, and as Jenna's belly grew, so did Nico's strength. His legs, once shaky and uncertain, had gained a new steadiness, and his determination had only grown fiercer. With every passing day, he moved with more confidence, proving time and again that he was not defined by his imperfections. One crisp autumn afternoon, Bradley returned home to find Jenna sitting on the porch, watching Maya and Nico in the yard. The golden light of the setting sun painted everything in warm hues, making the scene feel almost magical. Bradley wrapped his arms around Jenna from behind, resting his hands gently on her stomach. "You okay?" he murmured. Jenna nodded, her gaze fixed on their little family. "I was just thinking Nico was never supposed to make it. Everyone said he wouldn't survive, that he wasn't strong enough." Bradley followed her gaze to where Nico stood, his mismatched eyes shining with quiet determination. He was watching Maya intently, mimicking her stance, his tail swishing behind him. Jenna sighed, her voice thick with emotion. "But look at him now." Bradley pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Yeah," he murmured. "Look at him now." As if sensing their attention, Nico turned toward them, his ears perking up. Then, with an excited little bark, he bounded across the yard, his imperfect legs carrying him toward them with a determination that had become his trademark. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And as he curled up beside Jenna once more, pressing himself against her growing belly, she knew without a doubt that this was the life they had fought for. A life full of love. A life worth every battle. A life where miracles, no matter how small or unexpected, would always find a way. Unwavering guardian. Jenna's heart sank at Dr. Langston's words. She had always imagined pregnancy as a joyful, active experience, decorating the nursery, taking long walks with Bradley, preparing for the arrival of their child. But now, she was being told to stop, to rest, to surrender control. Bradley placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "Whatever it takes," he said softly. "We're going to get through this." Dr. Langston offered a sympathetic smile. "I know this isn't easy, but you have two very capable nurses right here." He nodded toward Maya and Nico, both of whom had been watching the entire visit with unwavering focus. I've never seen animals as attuned to their owner as these two. Jenna let out a shaky breath and reached down to stroke Maya's head. They've always known, she whispered, smiling despite the weight in her chest. A new routine. The following weeks were a test of patience for Jenna. Confined mostly to bed, she struggled with the stillness, the forced inaction. She wasn't used to being taken care of. She was used to pushing through, to handling things on her own. Maya and Nico, however, refused to let her feel alone. Maya became her silent guardian, lying beside the bed with her large, warm body pressed protectively against Jenna's legs. If Jenna shifted in discomfort, Maya would lift her head and nuzzle her reassuringly. Nico, in his own way, was just as diligent. He had taken to curling up against her stomach whenever she lay down, his mismatched eyes blinking up at her as if keeping watch over the life growing inside her. Every so often, he let out a soft chirp, as though speaking directly to the baby. At first, Bradley had been hesitant to leave Jenna's side, worried something would happen when he wasn't there. But soon, he realized he wasn't the only one looking after her. One evening, as he walked through the door after a long shift at the firehouse, he stopped in the doorway and just watched. Jenna was half asleep, curled up on her side with a book resting on her lap. Maya lay against her back, a silent, steady presence. And Nico tiny, determined Nico was sprawled across her belly, his head resting where their unborn child slept within her. Bradley's throat tightened. They weren't just pets. They were family. A mother's strength. As Jenna's pregnancy progressed, the challenges grew. The dizziness worsened, the exhaustion became overwhelming, and the anxiety of carrying a high-risk pregnancy weighed heavily on her mind. One night, she awoke to a sharp, twisting pain in her lower abdomen. A wave of nausea hit her, followed by dizziness so intense that the room seemed to spin out of focus. She gasped, gripping the sheets. Maya was up instantly, her ears perked, her nose pressing urgently against Jenna's arm. Nico followed a heartbeat later, his small body trembling as he let out a distressed whimper. Jenna tried to breathe through the pain, but the fear gripped her tighter than anything else. Bradley bolted upright beside her. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. "Something's not right." Maya let out a low, urgent whine, her eyes darting between Jenna and Bradley, as if urging them to act. Bradley didn't waste another second. He scooped Jenna up into his arms, careful but firm. Maya and Nico followed closely, their distress evident as they climbed into the car beside her. The hospital lights were too bright, the beeping monitors too loud, the air too sterile. But through it all, Bradley never let go of Jenna's hand. Maya and Nico had to wait outside, but Jenna could feel them. She knew they were there, waiting, watching, protecting. The hours blurred together. Doctors came and went. Machines monitored every heartbeat, every contraction, every fragile moment. And then relief. "The baby is stable," the doctor finally said, his voice warm with reassurance. "But you'll need to stay here for a few days. Just as a precaution." Jenna exhaled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She turned to Bradley, who pressed a kiss to her forehead, his own eyes glassy with emotion. "We're okay," she whispered. "We're okay." Coming home. When they finally returned home days later, exhausted but relieved, Maya and Nico greeted them with an intensity that left Jenna breathless. Maya immediately pressed her body against Jenna, sniffing her carefully before nudging her stomach. Nico whined, pacing in anxious circles before settling at Jenna's feet. "They were worried," Bradley murmured, rubbing Maya's ears. Jenna nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "So was I." She lowered herself onto the couch, letting Maya rest beside her. Nico scrambled up onto her lap, curling against her belly like he always did. "You two never gave up on me," Jenna whispered. "And I won't give up either." Bradley sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We're in this together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the room in golden light, Jenna let out a deep breath. She wasn't just carrying a baby. She was carrying a love that had already surrounded her, protected her, and fought for her, one that had come in the form of a devoted husband, a fierce German shepherd, and a tiny, imperfect pup who had defied every odd. And with them beside her, She knew they could face anything. A mother's instinct. Bradley reached out, his fingers brushing against Jenna's hand as he searched her face for reassurance. "Jenna," he said carefully, "I think we need to call the doctor." Jenna hesitated, glancing down at Maya, who still hadn't moved from her protective stance. Nico, normally so playful, remained still, his small frame pressed against her like a tiny shield. A lump formed in her throat. Maya had never reacted like this before, not even when they first discovered she was pregnant. With a slow breath, she nodded. "Okay." Bradley grabbed his phone, dialing the emergency line for Dr. Langston's office. As he spoke in hushed tones, Jenna stroked Maya's fur, grounding herself in the warmth and steady presence of her companion. "It's probably nothing," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. But she wasn't sure if she believed that anymore. Bradley hung up, his expression tense. "Dr. Langston says we should go to the hospital. Just to be safe." Jenna's pulse quickened. The idea of something being wrong with the baby sent icy fear through her veins. But before she could let panic take hold, Maya pressed her nose against her stomach in a gentle but firm motion, as if to say, "You're not alone." A silent warning. The drive to the hospital was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic patter of rain against the windshield. Maya and Nico had insisted on coming. Jenna didn't have the heart to make them stay behind. They curled up in the back seat, their eyes fixed on her, unwavering in their quiet vigilance. At the hospital, Bradley helped Jenna inside while a nurse led them to an exam room. Maya and Nico waited anxiously in the car, their faces pressed against the windows as if watching over her from afar. Dr. Langston arrived quickly, his presence calm but professional. "Tell me exactly what happened." Jenna described the sharp pain, the way it had stolen her breath, how it had come and gone like a storm cloud passing overhead. "But it wasn't just that," she admitted, glancing at Bradley. "Maya and Nico, they knew something was wrong before I did." Dr. Langston arched a brow. "Dogs have an uncanny sense when it comes to human health. They pick up on things even medical tests can't detect." Jenna swallowed. "So you think?" "I think we should take every precaution," Dr. Langston said, already pulling up an ultrasound machine. "Let's see what's going on." Bradley squeezed Jenna's hand as the cool gel met her skin. The room was thick with tension as the monitor flickered to life, the grainy image revealing the tiny life they had fought so hard for. Then, a steady, rhythmic sound filled the space thump 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 thump. Bradley exhaled, his grip tightening. "That's..." Dr. Langston smiled. "A strong heartbeat." Jenna let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears pricking her eyes. "The baby's okay?" "The baby's okay," Dr. Langston confirmed. "But you were having early contractions. Nothing too serious, but enough to be a warning. Your body is telling you to slow down." Or maybe, Jenna thought Maya and Nico were the ones giving the warning all along. Homeward bound. That night, as they returned home, Maya and Nico greeted them with eager whimpers and wagging tails. Jenna crouched down, running her hands through Maya's fur, whispering, "You knew, didn't you?" Maya licked her face, her warm breath washing over Jenna's cheek, while Nico nestled against her belly, chirping softly. Bradley stood watching them, arms crossed over his chest. "I think they're more in tune with you than we are," he said, shaking his head in amazement. Jenna laughed softly, exhaustion evident in her voice. "Maybe they are." Bradley guided her inside, urging her toward the couch. "Bed rest, remember?" Jenna rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She lay down, feeling the weight of the day settle over her. As soon as she did, Maya curled up beside her, her large protective body pressing gently against her legs. Nico climbed up, resting his head right over her stomach. Jenna closed her eyes, listening to the soothing sounds of the rain outside, feeling the warmth of her loyal protectors beside her. She realized then that no matter what the coming months held, she would never be facing them alone. She had Bradley. She had Maya. She had Nico. And together, they would protect the little life growing inside her with everything they had. A mother's watchful eye. As the days went by, Jenna noticed the shift in Maya's behavior more clearly. The once ever vigilant German Shepherd, who had never left her side, now observed from a short distance. She still watched Jenna's every movement, but more and more, she let Nico take the lead. It was as if Maya was training her son, preparing him for something Jenna couldn't quite understand. Jenna rested her hand on her belly, feeling the tiny movements inside. The thought made her heart swell. She wasn't the only one preparing for the arrival of their baby. Maya and Nico were too. Bradley walked onto the porch, carrying a mug of tea. He handed it to Jenna, then crouched down to ruffle Nico's fur. "He's changed," Bradley murmured. "Look at him." Jenna nodded, watching the small but determined pup. Nico, once so fragile, now stood with confidence, his mismatched eyes scanning the yard, his posture steady and sure. He had grown into a quiet protector, one who had overcome every obstacle life had placed in his path. Bradley sat beside Jenna, exhaling softly. "I've been thinking a lot," he admitted, his gaze on the horizon. "About how much these two have done for us. How they always seem to know things before we do." Jenna tilted her head, sensing something in his tone. "What do you mean?" Bradley turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "I mean, what if they're not just watching over you?" He hesitated before continuing. "What if they're watching over the baby?" Jenna's heart skipped a beat at the thought. She had always believed in the unspoken connection between animals and humans. But now, as she watched Nico settle beside her, pressing his small frame against her growing belly, she felt it deeper than ever. A mother's instinct. That night, Jenna found herself struggling to sleep. She shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the pregnancy making it difficult to find a good position. Bradley had dozed off beside her, but the steady rhythm of his breathing did little to soothe her. Maya and Nico had taken their places on the floor beside the bed, but unlike other nights, they weren't sleeping. Their eyes remained open, glowing faintly in the dim light. Jenna sighed, running a hand over her belly. "What is it, you two?" she whispered. As if in response, Nico suddenly lifted his head, ears twitching. Maya followed a second later, her muscles tensing. Then it happened. A sharp pain shot through Jenna's stomach, sudden and intense. She gasped, gripping the blankets. Before she could say a word, Maya was on her feet, letting out a deep, urgent bark, one that sent Bradley bolting upright. "Jenna!" His voice was thick with panic as he reached for her. She struggled to speak, the pain making her breathless. "Something's wrong." Without hesitation, Bradley jumped out of bed, grabbing his phone to call the doctor. Maya whined anxiously, pacing in tight circles, while Nico pressed against Jenna, his small body trembling. Minutes later, Bradley helped Jenna into the car, Maya and Nico following close behind. Maya, normally composed, barked at the door as if urging them to hurry. Even Nico, who rarely vocalized his emotions, let out a distressed chirp. The drive to the hospital was a blur of fear and urgency. Bradley clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Jenna focused on breathing through the pain, but her mind kept returning to Maya and Nico. They had known. They had known before she did. A life worth protecting. At the hospital, doctors rushed Jenna into an examination room. The next hour was a haze of tests, voices, and medical jargon. Bradley stayed by her side, his hand gripping hers tightly. Finally, Dr. Langston entered the room, his expression serious but calm. "Your body was showing early signs of preterm labor," he explained. "But we caught it in time. You and the baby are stable, but we'll need to monitor you closely." Relief flooded Jenna so fast it made her dizzy. She blinked back tears, squeezing Bradley's hand. When they were finally allowed to leave, the first thing Jenna saw in the hospital parking lot was Maya and Nico, waiting anxiously inside the car. As soon as she opened the door, Maya whined, pushing her head into Jenna's lap, while Nico scrambled up beside her, sniffing her stomach as if checking to make sure everything was okay. Jenna buried her face in Maya's fur, whispering, "You knew, didn't you? You both did." A bond that couldn't be broken. Back home, as Jenna settled onto the couch, she watched Maya and Nico curl up beside her, their protective presence a constant reassurance. She rested a hand on her belly, feeling the faintest flutter of movement from her baby. She smiled softly. Her family had always been incomplete. Until now. Looking at Maya and Nico, her protectors, her silent guardians, she realized she had never been alone. She never would be. A silent warning. Bradley sat up, heart pounding as he tried to shake off the haze of sleep. Beside him, Jenna stirred, groaning softly as she attempted to sit up. The frantic scratching at the door didn't stop, growing more desperate. "Nico?" Bradley called groggily. The small German Shepherd mix let out a sharp whine, his mismatched eyes flashing in the dim light. He wasn't just restless, he was terrified. Jenna rubbed her stomach, a familiar dull ache spreading through her lower abdomen. She winced, breathing deeply. "Something's wrong," she whispered. Maya, who had been curled up at the foot of the bed, suddenly lifted her head. Her ears twitched, and in a rare moment, she let out a deep, guttural bark that sent chills down Bradley's spine. Maya almost never barked. That was enough for him. "Get dressed," he told Jenna, already reaching for his phone to call the hospital. A race against time. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Nico, despite his usual dislike of car rides, sat pressed against Jenna's belly, his whines persistent, almost rhythmic, as if he were urging her to hold on. Jenna clenched her jaw, gripping Bradley's hand as waves of pain intensified. "It's too soon," she whispered, her voice laced with fear. Bradley's grip tightened. "We're almost there." By the time they reached the hospital, nurses were already rushing to Jenna's side, helping her onto a wheelchair. Nico tried to follow, but hospital staff gently held him back. He whined loudly, straining against his leash as Maya stood beside him, watching Jenna disappear through the doors. A mother's instinct. Hours passed in a blur. Bradley paced the waiting room, running his hands through his hair as doctors worked to stabilize Jenna and the baby. Every now and then, he glanced toward the entrance, where Maya and Nico sat with one of the nurses who had taken a liking to them. Nico's eyes never left the double doors, his tail still, his entire body rigid. Maya, ever the composed one, occasionally nudged him. Finally, the doors swung open, and Dr. Langston stepped out. Bradley's breath caught. "She's stable," the doctor said, offering a reassuring nod. "We managed to stop the labor. The baby's still safe, but Jenna will need strict bed rest from now on. No stress, no exertion." Bradley exhaled, the weight of worry momentarily lifting from his chest. "What about the dogs?" Dr. Langston asked, his gaze flickering to the anxious pair waiting by the door. Bradley glanced at them and smiled faintly. "I think they knew before any of us did. Home, but changed. Back home, the house felt different, more fragile, more precious. Jenna was confined to the couch for most of the day, and Nico never left her side. Maya remained watchful, but had shifted into a quieter role. She no longer hovered over Jenna the way she used to, as if silently passing the role of protector to her son. One afternoon, as Jenna lay resting, Nico climbed carefully onto the couch, pressing his head against her belly. His mismatched eyes blinked slowly, and he let out a soft, familiar whine. Jenna smiled, running her fingers through his fur. "You already love this baby, don't you?" Nico responded with a gentle lick to her hand. Bradley, watching from the doorway, felt a lump rise in his throat. He thought back to all the times people had doubted Nico, had said he was too weak, too broken, not worth saving. But here he was, their family's fiercest protector, proving everyone wrong. A new beginning. Weeks passed, and the pregnancy remained stable. The day Jenna finally made it to full term, a quiet celebration filled the house. Then, on a crisp autumn morning, as golden light streamed through their bedroom window, Jenna gave birth to a healthy baby girl. When they brought her home, Nico was the first to greet her. He pressed his nose against the baby's tiny foot, sniffing gently before letting out a soft chirp, his own way of saying hello. Maya watched from a distance, then, with an approving huff, lay down, resting her head between her paws. Bradley wrapped an arm around Jenna, watching as Nico curled up protectively beside their daughter's bassinet. "Looks like she's already got a guardian," Jenna whispered. Bradley smiled. "The best one. A guardian's gift." The rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors filled the quiet room as Jenna slowly opened her eyes. White ceiling tiles came into focus, their stark brightness almost overwhelming. Her body felt impossibly heavy, like she was floating just beneath the surface of sleep. Then she felt its warmth. A steady, grounding warmth wrapped around her hand. She turned her head slightly, her vision still blurry, but she knew the touch before she could see him. Bradley, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Bradley's face appeared in her line of sight, his expression strained with exhaustion but filled with unmistakable relief. His grip on her tightened as he exhaled deeply, as if he'd been holding his breath for hours. "Hey," he murmured, brushing a few strands of hair from her damp forehead. "You're okay. You and the baby, you're both okay." Jenna swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as everything rushed back. The pain, the panic, the drive to the hospital, Nico. Her breath hitched. The baby? Bradley smiled, though his eyes were glassy with emotion. She's here. She's perfect. Jenna let out a shaky exhale, her free hand drifting instinctively to her abdomen, which now felt strangely empty. I didn't get to see her." "You will," Bradley reassured her. "They're just making sure she's strong enough before bringing her in." He hesitated before adding, "It was close, Jen. If we'd waited any longer." His voice trailed off, thick with emotion. Jenna felt a tear slip down her cheek, overwhelmed by the weight of what could have been. But before she could let fear take hold, a sound broke through the haze. A soft, familiar whimper. Her head snapped toward the doorway, and there he was, Nico. More than a dog. The little German Shepherd mix sat in the doorway, his mismatched eyes locked onto her face. His crooked tail twitched anxiously, and he let out another soft whine, his body trembling as if he could barely contain himself. Jenna's heart clenched. "He wouldn't leave," Bradley said quietly. "I tried to take him home, but he refused. He's been waiting outside since the moment we got here." Nico let out another sound, a half whimper, half chirp, then slowly took a step forward. He wasn't just excited to see her, he was checking on her. Jenna's throat tightened as she extended her hand. "Come here, sweet boy." Nico hesitated for only a second before bounding forward, his paws making soft taps against the hospital floor. He reached her bedside and pressed his small, warm body against her, burying his face into her arm. Jenna felt the rapid beat of his heart, and suddenly she wasn't sure who was comforting who. "I don't know how," Bradley murmured, his voice thick with awe, but he knew. Long before we did. Jenna closed her eyes, running her fingers through Nico's fur. "He saved us." Bradley nodded. "Yeah, he really did." The first meeting. The door creaked open again, and a nurse entered, wheeling in a small hospital bassinet. "Are you ready to meet your daughter?" she asked with a warm smile. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. She had waited for this moment for years, dreamed of it through endless heartbreak and doubt. And now it was real. The nurse gently lifted the swaddled bundle from the bassinet and placed her into Jenna's waiting arms. A tiny weight settled against her chest, warm and perfect. Jenna gasped softly. "She's beautiful," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking. The baby let out a tiny yawn, her delicate fingers curling into a fist. Jenna traced her daughter's impossibly soft cheek, memorizing every tiny feature. Then, as if sensing the moment, Nico inched closer. Jenna glanced at the nurse, who hesitated before nodding with an understanding smile. Carefully, she shifted, lowering her baby just slightly. Nico watched with wide, reverent eyes, his tail going completely still. Slowly, he leaned in, sniffing gently. Then, he let out a quiet chirp, pressing his nose softly against the baby's tiny hand. Jenna let out a soft, watery laugh. "He approves." Bradley chuckled, swiping at his eyes. "She's got her own guardian already." Maya, who had been patiently waiting by the door, let out a soft huff before padding forward. She pressed her nose against Jenna's shoulder, as if to check on her as well. Jenna met Bradley's gaze, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "This family," she whispered, looking down at the tiny life in her arms, then at the two dogs who had become so much more than pets. "We saved each other, didn't we?" Bradley swallowed hard before nodding. "Yeah, Jen, we really did." As the room settled into peaceful quiet, Nico curled up beside them, his duty far from over. He had saved them once, and Jenna knew deep in her bones that he would spend the rest of his life protecting the family that had once saved him. They had given him a chance. And in return, he had given them everything. A guardian's instinct. Bradley caught Jenna just in time, lowering her carefully onto the couch as her body went limp in his arms. His heart pounded in his chest, panic surging through his veins. "Jenna," he called urgently, lightly tapping her cheek. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering, confusion clouding her gaze. "What happened?" she murmured weakly. Bradley exhaled shakily, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "You passed out." His voice was tight, filled with worry. "I think your blood pressure dropped." At his feet, Nico let out a whimper, his mismatched eyes darting between Jenna and Bradley. He pressed his small frame against Jenna's legs, his body vibrating with nervous energy. His growl from earlier had been a warning, a desperate attempt to stop her before she could push herself too far. Maya watched from her usual spot across the room, her wise brown eyes observing, but she made no move to interfere. It was clear now she had passed the role of Jenna's protector to Nico. Bradley helped Jenna lean back against the cushions, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone. "I'm calling the doctor." Jenna shook her head, her hand resting lightly on his wrist. "I just need to rest," she whispered. "Nico knew before I did. He stopped me before it got worse." Bradley hesitated, looking between his wife and the small dog who had become so much more than just a pet. He had trusted Nico before. Could he do it again? An unspoken connection. The days stretched into weeks, and Jenna remained on strict bed rest. Every moment of her day was carefully monitored, every movement planned. Bradley adjusted his work schedule, and when he couldn't be home, her mother or a nurse stayed with her. But through it all, Nico remained her most constant guardian. Whenever she tried to shift positions, he was there, nudging her gently into a safer posture. When she became too still for too long, he would whine softly, prompting her to move enough to keep her circulation steady. If Maya noticed anything out of the ordinary, she'd glance at Nico, as if silently communicating, "You handle this." One evening, Jenna lay curled up on the couch, exhaustion weighing heavily on her limbs. The dim glow of the TV flickered across the room, and Bradley sat beside her, scrolling absently through his phone. Nico was curled against her legs, his body warm and reassuring. His breathing was slow and steady until suddenly, it wasn't. Bradley barely noticed the shift at first. Nico's ears twitched, his body tensing against Jenna's legs. His mismatched eyes darted toward her stomach, his entire frame rigid. Then, he let out a soft, high-pitched chirp, a sound Bradley had come to recognize as a warning. Jenna stirred, wincing slightly. "Nico?" she murmured, confused by his sudden change in behavior. But the dog didn't relax. Instead, he pawed at her stomach gently, whining louder now. Bradley sat up straighter, his phone slipping from his hands. "Jenna, what's wrong?" A strange look passed over her face. "I don't know. I just feel strange." Nico let out another whimper, pacing in small circles before returning to her side, pressing his body firmly against her stomach. His entire demeanor screamed urgency. Bradley didn't hesitate. "We're going to the hospital, now." A race against time. The drive to the hospital was tense. Bradley kept one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back to comfort Jenna, whose face was pale with growing discomfort. Nico sat beside her in the back seat, his nose pressed against her belly, his whole body trembling as if he could feel something they couldn't. By the time they reached the emergency entrance, Jenna's breathing had become shallow, her grip on Bradley's hand weak. Doctors and nurses rushed to her side as Bradley explained everything in a frantic rush. Nico barked, whining and pacing as they wheeled Jenna away. "Sir, you'll have to wait here," a nurse told him, placing a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. Bradley nodded numbly, his whole body tense. He turned to Nico, whose mismatched eyes reflected nothing but fear and understanding. "She's gonna be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for Nico's sake or his own. The miracle they never expected. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Bradley sat in the waiting room, staring blankly at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. Nico lay at his feet, unmoving, his gaze locked on the hallway where Jenna had disappeared. Then, finally, a doctor appeared. "Mr. Carter?" Bradley jumped to his feet. "Is she?" "She's stable," the doctor reassured him. "Your wife and daughter are both safe." The world tilted. A daughter. Jenna had given birth. He stumbled forward, barely hearing the rest of the doctor's words as relief crashed over him. His vision blurred as he turned to Nico, who was already on his feet, ears perked, tail wagging. "You knew," Bradley whispered. "You always knew." Nico let out a happy chirp, pressing his face against Bradley's leg. A new beginning. Jenna lay propped up in her hospital bed, looking exhausted but radiant, a tiny bundle nestled against her chest. Bradley moved toward them slowly, as if afraid the moment might break if he moved too fast. "She's perfect," Jenna whispered, brushing her fingers over the baby's soft cheek. And then, with careful precision, she reached for Nico. The little German Shepherd mix hopped up onto the edge of the bed, his mismatched eyes filled with wonder as he sniffed the air around the baby. Then, gently, he pressed his nose against her tiny hand. Jenna let out a soft laugh. "Looks like she's already got her protector." Bradley swallowed past the lump in his throat. "We all do." As he looked at the family they had built, the one they had fought so hard for, he knew one thing for certain. Nico wasn't just a dog. He was a miracle. Nico's final warning. Bradley tightened his grip on the leash, his heart hammering as he watched Jenna disappear behind the emergency room doors. Nico whined, his body trembling with distress, his mismatched eyes locked on the place where she had vanished. A nurse approached, offering a sympathetic smile. "You can wait in the family lounge," she said gently. Bradley barely heard her. His mind was spinning, caught between the worry, clawing at his chest, and the overwhelming realization that this wasn't just an ordinary emergency. Nico had known again. Maya had sensed it too, but she had stayed home, as if passing the responsibility to her son. It was Nico who had alerted them. Nico who had refused to rest. Nico who had saved Jenna's life once before. What if they hadn't listened? What if he had dismissed the signs? He ran a shaky hand through his hair and led Nico to the waiting area, his fingers trembling as he texted Jenna's mother and the rest of their family. Every second dragged. Nico refused to settle. He paced at Bradley's feet, whining softly, his ears swiveling toward every sound from the hospital corridor. Every time a doctor or nurse passed by, Nico's head snapped up, his body tensed as if waiting for news. Then, at last, a doctor appeared. "Mr. Carter?" Bradley jumped to his feet. Nico immediately alerted his side. "Your wife is stable," the doctor assured him. "Her condition escalated quickly, but we were able to intervene in time. You made the right decision bringing her in." Bradley exhaled a shaky breath, his chest tight with relief. "And the baby?" His voice cracked on the words. The doctor hesitated for just a moment. "It was a difficult delivery, but she's here. Your daughter is here, and she's strong." A wave of emotions crashed over Bradley so forcefully he had to grip the back of a chair for support. A daughter. A miracle. A life they had fought so hard to bring into the world. The doctor smiled. "Your wife is asking for you, and I think for him, too." He nodded toward Nico, who had been silent for the first time since they arrived. The little German Shepherd mix sat perfectly still, his mismatched eyes locked on the doctor, as if waiting for permission to reunite with his family. Bradley let out a short, shaky laugh. He wouldn't have it any other way. The first meeting. When they entered Jenna's hospital room, the air felt different, lighter, full of something indescribable. Jenna lay propped up against a stack of pillows, her hair damp with exhaustion, but her eyes glowed with something new. A tiny bundle rested in her arms, wrapped in a soft pink blanket. Nico let out a soft, questioning whimper, stepping forward hesitantly. His mismatched eyes widened as he took in the sight of the newborn, his crooked tail wagging slightly but cautiously. Jenna smiled, her voice soft. "Come here, Nico." Bradley unhooked the leash, but Nico didn't leap forward like an excited dog meeting someone new. Instead, he moved slowly, carefully, as if he understood how delicate the moment was. He reached the bed and lifted his nose toward the baby, sniffing gently before pressing his forehead against the blanket. The room went silent. Jenna blinked back tears. Bradley swallowed hard. This wasn't just curiosity. This was understanding. Nico had known before any of them. He had sensed the danger, felt the urgency, and fought to protect them every step of the way. And now, standing beside them, He was welcoming the newest member of their family with the same fierce devotion. Maya had trained him well. Bradley knelt beside them, rubbing a hand over Nico's fur. "You saved her," he whispered. Nico let out a soft chirp, his signature sound, the same one that had first warned them, the same one that had echoed through their lives like a promise. Jenna laughed, sniffling. "I think he wants to meet her properly." Carefully, she lowered the baby just a little, letting Nico press his nose to her tiny fingers. The baby let out a sleepy sigh, her hand twitching slightly as if trying to grasp the unfamiliar warmth. For the first time since the terrifying ordeal began, Bradley let himself truly breathe. They had made it. All of them. A new chapter begins. Days later, when Jenna and their daughter were finally home, the house felt different. Warmer. More whole. Maya greeted them at the door, her tail wagging slowly, her eyes scanning Jenna first before landing on the baby. The old shepherd sniffed cautiously, then looked toward Nico, waiting for his reaction. Nico didn't hesitate. He trotted forward and lay down beside Jenna, curling his body protectively around the bassinet where the baby slept. Maya seemed to approve, settling beside him. Bradley watched them for a long time, his chest aching with gratitude. There had been so many moments where they thought they wouldn't make it. So many nights filled with fear, with uncertainty. But through it all, Nico had been there, this little dog they had once been told wouldn't survive, who had been deemed too broken, too weak. Now, he was their strongest protector. Jenna leaned against Bradley, her head resting on his shoulder. "We should name her." Bradley smiled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I think she already has a guardian." Jenna glanced down at Nico, who kept his mismatched eyes locked on the sleeping baby. "Then it has to be something fitting," she whispered. Bradley nodded. They had saved Nico. And in return, he'd saved them all. A miracle wrapped in fur. A protector born from love. A story that would last forever. A new beginning. Jenna exhaled a shaky breath as she sank into the couch, cradling baby Lena in her arms. The house, though quiet, pulsed with a new energy, one that spoke of change, of new life, of a love deeper than words could express. Maya patted forward cautiously, her gaze locked onto the tiny bundle in Jenna's arms. For a moment, she hesitated, sniffing the air, her deep brown eyes filled with curiosity and something else understanding. She had sensed Jenna's pregnancy before anyone else, watched over her like a silent guardian, and now, here was the life she had been waiting for. With careful grace, Maya stepped closer and lowered her head, pressing her nose gently against Lena's blanket. The baby stirred slightly but remained peacefully asleep. Maya let out a soft huff, her tail wagging in slow, measured sweeps, a silent approval. Then, there was Nico. Unlike Maya, he didn't hesitate. His mismatched eyes had never left Lena since they arrived home. He moved with quiet purpose, trotting forward and hopping onto the couch beside Jenna, his small frame curling protectively against her leg. Jenna chuckled softly, stroking his fur. "You don't waste time, do you, buddy?" Nico didn't respond, at least not in the way a typical dog might. Instead, he pressed his forehead against Jenna's arm, right next to where Lena lay nestled. His body remained alert, his ears twitching at every small sound the baby made. Even as his tail flicked in contentment, there was a quiet intensity about him, as though he understood that his role had shifted yet again. He wasn't just protecting Jenna anymore. He was watching over Lena, too. Unbreakable bonds. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into a new rhythm. The house, once filled with worry and sleepless nights of uncertainty, now carried the gentle hum of something beautiful, a family growing into itself. Maya remained her steady, watchful self, observing from a distance but always present. She had stepped back, allowing Nico to take the lead, yet she was still there, ready if needed. But Nico, he was everywhere. He followed Jenna from room to room, always keeping her and Lena within his sight. When Jenna rocked Lena to sleep in the nursery, Nico curled up at her feet, his ears twitching at every coo and sigh the baby made. If Lena so much as stirred in her bassinet, Nico was there first, standing on his hind legs to peek over the edge, his mismatched eyes scanning her tiny face for any sign of distress. Bradley had never seen anything like it. One afternoon, As Jenna rested on the couch with Lena asleep on her chest, Bradley walked in and found Nico sitting beside them, his head resting against Jenna's stomach as he listened to Lena's slow, steady breaths. Bradley smiled, crouching down to scratch Nico's ears. "You never stop, do you?" he murmured. Nico let out a quiet chirp, one of the many strange little sounds he had always made. But this was a sound of contentment, of knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Bradley glanced at Maya, who was watching from her bed across the room. She met his gaze, blinking slowly, almost as if to say, "You see it too, don't you?" He did. This wasn't just loyalty. It wasn't just a dog's natural instinct to protect its owner. Nico knew. He had known before any of them. And he would always know. The silent warning. Late one night, Jenna and Bradley sat in bed, exhausted but content. Lena was asleep in the bassinet beside them, her tiny hands curled into soft fists. Nico lay on the floor at Jenna's side, his chest rising and falling with deep, even breaths. Maya was at the foot of the bed, eyes half closed, her ears flicking every now and then. For the first time in months, everything felt calm. Then, just as Jenna was about to drift off, Nico's body tensed. His ears shot forward. His mismatched eyes flew open. He lifted his head sharply, nose twitching. Bradley noticed first. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, sitting up. Nico didn't move at first. He was listening, his muscles locked in place. Then, in one swift motion, he stood, jumped onto the bed, and positioned himself directly over Lena's bassinet. Jenna's heart pounded. "Bradley." Then, Maya moved. She didn't hesitate. She stood up quickly, her hackles rising as she let out a low, warning growl. Jenna and Bradley exchanged wide-eyed glances. A split second later, a strange beeping sound filled the room. Jenna turned toward Lena's bassinet just in time to see the small baby monitor flash red. Then came the worst sound she had ever heard, Lena gasping, her tiny chest rising and falling rapidly, struggling for air. Panic seized Jenna's chest. "Bradley!" she gasped. Bradley was already moving, grabbing Lena and lifting her into his arms, gently rubbing her back. "Come on, baby! Breathe," he whispered frantically. Nico pressed against Jenna's leg, his whimpers filled with distress. Maya paced the room, her protective instincts kicking in as she watched her humans fight against fear. Seconds felt like hours. Then a breath. A soft, weak inhale. Lena's body relaxed, her tiny mouth opening as air filled her lungs again. Jenna burst into tears, clutching her chest as Bradley sank onto the bed, holding their daughter close. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Because once again, before the danger had even fully arrived, Nico had known. More than a dog. The morning light filtered through the windows, painting the nursery in soft hues of gold. Lena lay peacefully in her crib, her breathing steady. Maya sat beside the rocking chair, her job as silent protector still intact. And Nico? Nico was curled up beneath the crib, his head resting on his paws, his mismatched eyes never leaving the baby. Jenna knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "You knew," she whispered. "Just like you always do." Nico let out a soft, sleepy chirp, pressing his head into her touch. She smiled through her tears. "You're more than just a dog, aren't you?" And deep down, Jenna already knew the answer. Nico had never been just a dog. He was family. Their guardian. Their miracle. The guardian's purpose. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest, her breath unsteady as she reached for Bradley's arm. The encounter with the coyote had lasted mere moments, but the weight of what had just happened settled deep within her. Nico had changed before her eyes. Gone was the fragile, awkward pup they had once fought to save. He was no longer just a dog with mismatched eyes and uncertain footing. He had stepped into his role completely, a protector, a guardian. And he had done it without hesitation. Maya moved first, pressing her nose against Nico's forehead in quiet acknowledgement. Jenna swallowed back the lump in her throat, crouching down to stroke his fur. "You knew exactly what to do," she whispered. "You didn't even hesitate." Nico's mismatched eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second, she saw something deeper in them, a silent understanding that ran far beyond instincts. He had never been just an ordinary dog. He had always known his purpose, a bond that couldn't be broken. That night, back in the warmth of their home, Lena slept peacefully in her crib. The soft glow of the nightlight cast gentle shadows across the nursery walls. Nico, as always, was stationed beneath her crib, his head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but still alert. Maya watched from the doorway, her presence more distant now, as if she was stepping back, letting Nico take full responsibility. Jenna leaned against the nursery doorframe, arms wrapped around herself, her gaze drifting between her daughter and the dog who had saved her more times than she could count. Bradley came up behind her, slipping an arm around her waist. "You okay?" She nodded, but her voice came out thick with emotion. "He doesn't just watch over her. He feels when something is wrong before we do." Bradley exhaled, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. "He's different, Jen." Jenna let her fingers drift over Nico's fur as he let out a soft sigh, his body curling tighter against the crib. "Yeah," she murmured. "He always has been." As the days turned into weeks, Nico's devotion never wavered. If Lena so much as stirred in her sleep, he would alert Jenna before she even opened her eyes. If she cried, he would press his nose against her cheek, his quiet presence soothing her almost instantly. During tummy time on the living room rug, Nico would lie beside her, his body tense with readiness, as though prepared to intervene if she needed him. Even as she grew stronger, more aware of the world around her, he never let his guard down. One afternoon, Jenna sat on the porch, watching as Lena, now nearly 6 months old, lay on a blanket in the yard. She babbled happily, kicking her tiny feet in the air, her chubby fingers grasping at the soft fabric. Maya lay nearby, lazily watching the clouds shift overhead. And then there was Nico. He sat beside Lena, his ears flicking at every sound, his mismatched eyes locked on her tiny form. Jenna smiled softly, rubbing her hands over her arms. The autumn air had begun to settle in, crisp and cool. "Do you think he'll ever stop?" Bradley's voice was gentle as he sat beside her, handing her a cup of tea. Jenna shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I don't think he knows how." Proof that miracles exist. That night, as Jenna rocked Lena to sleep, Nico remained stationed by her feet. His body curled tightly against the rocker, his head resting against Jenna's foot. She hummed softly, brushing her fingers through Lena's dark curls. Looking down at Nico, she exhaled deeply. "I wonder if you knew all along," she mused quietly. "If you knew you were meant to be hers before we even did." Nico didn't move, but she felt the warmth of his breath against her ankle, steady and grounding. She thought back to the day they found him, how the vet had said he wouldn't make it. How people had doubted him. How they had nearly let him go. But here he was, standing guard over the child they had prayed for, the child they had feared they might never have. The miracle they had all fought so hard for. Jenna reached down, stroking behind Nico's ears, feeling the familiar rhythm of his breathing beneath her touch. "Maybe," she whispered, "you were the miracle we needed first." Nico let out a quiet, contented sigh, pressing his head into her palm. Jenna smiled, closing her eyes, feeling at peace for the first time in a long time. Because she knew, without a doubt, that no matter what life brought them next, Nico would always be there. The golden afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows across the backyard. Jenna sat on the porch, rocking gently, her eyes following Lena as she toddled across the grass. At 15 months old, their daughter was fearless, her laughter ringing through the air as she stumbled forward, arms outstretched. Beside her, Nico moved in sync with her steps, his body steady, his presence constant. Every time she wobbled, he was there, his unusual frame no longer weak but strong, his purpose clear. Maya lay nearby, her aging form stretched out beneath the shade of the oak tree. She watched with quiet wisdom, her brown eyes reflecting the pride of a mother who had done her job well. Jenna reached down, running her fingers gently through Maya's graying fur. "You gave him to us," she murmured, "and he's exactly who he was meant to be." Bradley stepped out, coffee in hand, leaning against the railing. His gaze softened as he watched Lena take another unsteady step, gripping onto Nico's fur. He never lets her fall, he said. Jenna smiled, warmth filling her chest. Because he was always meant to catch her. Inside the house, toys were scattered across the living room floor. Nico followed her every movement with quiet devotion, his mismatched eyes filled with an awareness that went beyond instinct. She was his. Lena stumbled again, but Nico braced himself, his body unwavering as she pressed her cheek against his fur, giggling in delight. Bradley exhaled, shaking his head in quiet awe. You know, he said, watching them, we spent so long thinking he was different, broken even. Jenna's fingers curled around his. But he was never broken, she whispered. He was just waiting for her. In that moment, watching their daughter and her guardian together, it was clear Nico's differences had never been imperfections. They were his strength, and they had led him right where he was meant to be. Nico's story is more than just a tale of resilience. It's a reflection of life's unexpected blessings. In a world that often prioritizes perfection, Nico reminds us that what makes us different is often what makes us extraordinary. We all face moments where we feel inadequate, where we believe we aren't enough, or that our challenges define us. But, like Nico, our perceived flaws can become our greatest strengths when we find the right purpose, the right people, and the right path. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories. This story teaches us the power of unconditional love and trust. Just as Jenna and Bradley learned to see past Nico's imperfections, we too must learn to embrace not only our own struggles, but also those of the people around us. True strength isn't about being flawless. It's about showing up, being present, and offering what we can, even when we feel unworthy. Nico's unwavering loyalty to Lena reminds us of the importance of consistency and devotion. Whether it's in our relationships, careers, or personal growth, the small acts of showing up every day, being reliable, being present matter far more than grand gestures. Trust is built in the quiet moments, in the everyday sacrifices, in the patient waiting. The advice we can take from this story? Embrace your differences. What you see as a weakness may be your greatest gift. Show up for the people who matter, even when it's hard. Trust your instincts sometimes. Like Nico, we sense things before we fully understand them. And most importantly, believe in second chances. Just because something starts in struggle doesn't mean it won't end in purpose. Your journey, no matter how imperfect, is leading you exactly where you're meant to be. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories.